The last thing Sergeant Danny Kowalski said before we crossed the wire was, "Don't step on anything that looks too clean." That was his tell. When Kowalski started talking in riddles, he was scared. We all were. Nobody said, it out loud, but you don't say it out loud. Slate 12 was what the maps called it. A 2-kilometer stretch of broken farmland east of the Kuna River Valley. Grid reference nobody wanted to read twice. Intel had flagged it 4 days ago. Movement. Possible IED emplacements. A downed UH-60 crew of 3 that nobody had heard from since 0340 the previous night. The pilot's last transmission had been 9 seconds of static, and then a single word. Contact. Pretty much that was it. Contact. Like the valley had reached up and taken them. We were 8 men. Alpha Team, 2nd Platoon, 101st Airborne. I was the team's medic. Specialist Marcus Webb, 24 years old, from a small town outside Knoxville, where the biggest emergency I'd ever seen before enlisting was a tractor fire on old Route 11. Now I was crossing into a grid square that 3 different officers had circled on a map and said, with the particular kind of quiet that means they're choosing their words carefully, exercise extreme caution. The morning was cold the way Afghan mornings get cold, bone deep, the kind that makes your knuckles ache inside your gloves. The mountains kind of in the east were turning gray-pink at the ridgelines. Below them, the valley floor was a mix of scrub brush, dried creek channels, and the remains of a pomegranate orchard that had been burned down at some point and never replanted. The blackened trunks stood in crooked rows like fence posts after a fire. I remember looking at those trees and thinking they looked like they were still trying to stand. Kowalski moved point. Behind him, Reyes, our saw gunner, 22, always chewing on something, always humming under his breath. Then Osei, sort of the team leader, Staff Sergeant Emmanuel Osei, who had done 3 prior deployments, moved through terrain the way water moves through a pipe. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just constant, deliberate flow. Behind Osei was Tillman, the radio operator, a kid from Montana who was so quiet for the first 2 months of deployment that we genuinely weren't sure he could speak. Then the rest, I guess, of the team, Vasquez Drummond and Crane, who was 6'3" and had a duck under every door frame in every compound we'd ever entered, and who despite this had never once hit his head because he was the most spatially aware human being I have ever met. And me, last in the stack, which is where the medic goes, which is the correct place for the medic to be. I had, I think, told myself that enough times that I almost believed it stopped bothering me. We moved in silence, except for the crunch of frost under our boots and the low hiss of the radio on Tillman's back. Every third step, I did the same thing. Eyes down to the ground, eyes up to the tree lean, eyes across the channel to the left. Kowalski's rule, which he'd drilled it into us until it was automatic. Well, down, up, across, and the rhythm of moving through a place that wanted you dead. 15 minutes in, Osei raised a fist. We stopped. Froze. I stopped breathing. He crouched low and pointed 2 fingers at something in the creek bed 20 meters ahead. I couldn't see it at first, just rocks and dry grass and the bones of what might have been a goat. Then I saw honestly the edge of it, which metal. A rotor, blade, cracked along the shaft, half buried in the silt. The hello. Osei came up on the radio, voice flat and quiet. Slate element. We've eyes on wreckage, which grid follows. He relayed the coordinates. The response from TOC came back in a burst of static. The valley for what it's worth. Walls were chewing up the signal. Tillman adjusted the antenna and tried again. This time was clearer, but barely. The battle captain's voice had that stretch-thin quality. Comm on top, something else underneath. Copy, Slate. Air is 30 mics out. Maintain position. 30 minutes. Kowalski turned back and looked at Osei. Osei looked at the wreckage, which then he looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Somewhere in that debris, there might be a crew that had been on the ground for 7 hours in the cold. 30 minutes was a long time. Osei gave the signal to move. The hello had come down hard in the creek bed, nose first, rotors shredded. One side of the fuselage had peeled back like a tin can. I didn't pretty much let myself process it visually as wreckage with people inside. I filed it the same way I'd learned to file everything out here. Data, terrain, variables, and You process the emotion later when you're somewhere that won't kill you for being distracted. Vasquez found the co-pilot first, and he was alive. Conscious, barely pinned under a section of panel that had folded down across his legs. Vasquez kept, one hand on the man's shoulder while we got the piece moved. The co-pilot's name was Chief Warrant Officer Dalton. He kept asking about the other two. Plus, we didn't have an answer for him yet. Reyes and Crane found the crew chief 60 meters upstream, where he'd been thrown free. He had a compound fracture in his right forearm and a laceration above his hairline that had bled enough to soak through the collar of his flight suit. He was sitting up when they found him, just sitting there in the creek bed, watching the mountains, very calm in the way that people get calm when their bodies have gone into a kind of protective numbness. His name was Santoro. He looked at Reyes when Reyes crouched next to him, and the first thing he said was, "The pilot's in the rocks, 20 meters north." "He's bad." I went north. The pilot, Captain Airman, had made it out of the aircraft. Whether he'd pulled himself out or been thrown, there was no way to know. He was wedged between two boulders at the edge of the creek bank, on his side, unconscious. His helmet was cracked along the left side. I got my gloves off and started working. Pulse there, breathing shallow, but present. I started going for what it's worth through my checklist the way Kowalski goes through terrain. Down, up, across. Head, airway, chest. That was when the first shot came in. It hit the rock face, 2 feet above my head. The crack of it was so sharp and so close that for a full half-second my brain refused to classify it as a gunshot. Then the second one came, and that one I understood completely. Osei's voice on the net. Contact north and raise position. 220, 400 meters. Then Kowalski, Grimmer. I've got movement on the south ridge too. We've got more than one. I pressed flat against the boulder with my body between the rocks and Airman. I could hear the engagement opening up, the staccato of Reyes's saw, the methodical crack of Osei's M4, Drummond calling out a distance. I kept my hands on Airman. I didn't have a choice. If I let go of the airway, he stopped breathing. So I stayed there with rounds hitting rock around me and kept working, and I remember thinking very clearly, this is insane, and then I remember thinking, don't let go. The firing intensified. Tillman's voice cut through on the radio, trying to reach the air asset, and I caught fragments of it. Distance, number of contact points, the urgency in his voice that he was working very hard to keep controlled. The air was still 22 minutes out, according to the last TOC call. 22 minutes is forever in a contact. 22 minutes is a geological epoch. Osei maneuvered the team into a loose perimeter around the crash site. Dalton, the co-pilot, had a tourniquet on his left leg now. Vasquez had done it, one-handed, using his knee to apply pressure while he kept his rifle up with the other arm. Santoro had taken a secondary rifle from the aircraft and was prone next to Crane, engaging the south ridge. His fractured arm was bad. He wasn't letting it slow him down. I got Airman's airway clear. I got a pressure bandage on the head wound. I got a cervical collar on him from my aid bag because I had no way of knowing what his spine looked like. I did all of it lying on my stomach behind a boulder while the valley echoed with gunfire, and someone somewhere on the south ridge was walking rounds and toward our position, each impact a little closer than the last. Kowalski came up on my right. Rifle up, scanning. Plus, how's the pilot? Alive. Can't move him without more hands. Tell me when. He said the same way he said everything, flat, even like he was discussing road conditions. Like the rounds that were now pocking the creek bank 12 meters from us were a minor inconvenience. That was Kowalski. That was the thing about Kowalski. I got, in my opinion, second line going into Airman's arm. I started fluids. I did the math in my head, blood pressure, estimated blood loss, time to definitive care, and the math was not good, but it was not yet catastrophic, and not yet catastrophic is something you can work with. Tillman's voice again, sharper. Air is 15 out. CAS flight to A-10s. Plus, call sign Reaper 41. 15 minutes. I could keep, basically, Airman alive for 15 minutes. The South Ridge fire picked up, which there's a sound A-10 makes when it rolls in on a gun run that you don't hear. So much as feel a low throb that gets into your sternum and stays there. I'd heard it twice before on this deployment. Both times I'd been safely behind a berm with a cup of terrible coffee, watching it happen to someone else. This time I was lying in a creek bed. Reaper, for one, to be fair, came up on Tillman's frequency 8 minutes out, not 15. The flight had pushed their speed, which meant someone back at base had told them what they were walking into and had decided the math was bad enough to skip the fuel calculation. I heard the brief exchange between Tillman and the pilot, a voice so calm and dry it sounded like a man reading a grocery list. Fire grid, enemy positions, friendly locations, restrictions. The pilot read it back without a single hesitation, like he was confirming an order at a drive-thru. Reaper copies all. Stand by for pass. Osei came over the internal net. All elements. Air is in. Mark your positions. Panels up. The orange VS. 17 panels went down across our perimeter. I, to be fair, couldn't see them from where I was, but I heard Drummond confirming. I kept my hands on Airman. His breathing had steadied slightly. The fluids were helping, or maybe my position behind the boulder was just good insulation from the wind. I told myself it was the fluids. The first gun run came from the north. The A-10 came, out of the gray morning sky at an angle I didn't even register until the cannon opened up, and then it was just sound, a sound that has no good description except to say it's somewhere between tearing metal and a thunderclap with a stutter, this grinding mechanical roar that turns your insides liquid. The rounds walked up the north ridge in a line of dust and impact, and then the aircraft was past, pulling up steeply, and the north ridge was quiet. Reyes, let to be fair, out a sound that wasn't quite a word. The south ridge fire continued. The second A-10 was coming around for its pass on that position, and I could track it by sound, the engine pitch rising as it lined up. Tillman was talking it onto the grid, and Crane was marking. Everything was textbook. Everything was working. And then sort of Kowalski said, very quietly, almost to himself, "Missile." I turned my head. I guess I shouldn't have. You're not supposed to take your eyes off your patient. But I turned my head, and I saw what Kowalski was looking at, a thin white contrail coming off the south ridge, low and flat, tracking northeast, tracking toward the aircraft. These things happen fast enough that your brain processes them in retrograde. You understand them fully only after they're already over. The man pad came off the ridge, and the second A-10 was in its approach, and in that half second, there was nothing anyone on the ground could do about anything at all. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that the pilot didn't know. Then I thought, maybe he did, because the aircraft moved. It broke right hard, in a way that seemed too deliberate to be evasive maneuvering. Not a random jink, but a specific intentional turn. It put itself between the missile's tracking solution and something. I couldn't understand what at first. The geometry wasn't making sense to me from ground level, the angles all compressed by perspective. Then Tillman said, slowly, he's covering the LZ. The landing zone. The medevac bird that had just called in on frequency, 2 minutes out, coming in from the east. Coming in from the exact bearing the missile was tracking toward. The A-10, I guess, turned into the missile, which I want to be careful here about what I say, because I didn't see all of it clearly, and the after-action was reconstructed from multiple sources, and there are things I know were told to me later that I didn't witness myself. What I saw was the aircraft break into the track, and then I saw the detonation. Not a direct hit, the countermeasures had partially done their job, and the warhead proximity fused, and then I saw the aircraft emerge from the smoke trailing something from its left engine nacelle, descending in a shallow arc to the northwest, the pilot already on emergency frequency, saying his status in a voice that was still, impossibly, infuriatingly calm, describing his bleed-off and his landing options like a man reading a grocery list. The medevac came in from the east. It landed in the creek bed 50 meters from my position, exactly where it was supposed to. I had airmen on a litter by the time the rotors were still spooling up. Vasquez had Dalton. 2 flight medics came off the bird and took over, and I let them. You hand it off when the right hands arrive. That's how it works. That's the only way it works, and I stepped back and found I was standing in the middle of the creek bed with my gloves still on, and blood on my jacket, and no clear memory of how I'd gotten from the boulder to where I was standing. Santoro, the crew chief with the fractured arm, walked to the medevac bird on his own. He stopped next to me before he got on. His face was gray pale from blood loss and cold. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "Tell the warthog guy." Then he sort of stopped, and he shook his head, and he got on the bird. He didn't finish the sentence. I think because there wasn't a sentence that fit. The A-10 came down in a dry riverbed 7 kilometers northwest of our position. The pilot put it down gear up on a flat stretch of river gravel in what the flight evaluation board would later describe, with a tone of barely contained disbelief, as a textbook forced landing. He walked sort of away from it. He walked away with a cut above his right eye from where his helmet hit the canopy frame on touchdown, and a sprained wrist, and nothing else. His name was Captain James Ferreira, 31 years old. He'd been flying A-10s for 6 years. He gave his account to the board in the same flat, unhurried way he'd talked on the radio. He said, I think he saw the missile tracking toward the inbound medevac. He said the medevac was a higher value asset in that moment. He said he had countermeasures deployed and calculated he had a viable probability of either defeating the missile outright or failing that, absorbing the proximity detonation, and retaining aircraft control long enough to clear the medevac's approach lane. He said the calculation was straightforward. The board member who asked the follow-up question reportedly just looked at him for a moment before writing something down. I read the summary of Ferreira's testimony later at Bagram while I was waiting for a flight home. I read it 3 times. The part that stayed with me wasn't the maneuver itself, or the forced landing, or any of the technical language. It was that phrase, the calculation was straightforward, because I had done the calculation from the ground, watching it happen, and it had not looked straightforward to me at all. It had looked like an equation where one of the variables was Ferreira's life, and he had just quietly subtracted it. Captain Airman came out of surgery at Bagram with a fractured skull, a subdural hematoma, and 2 cracked vertebrae that never fully healed. He was medically retired 14 months later. I got a letter from him about 2 years after the deployment. He knew my name from the after action, which he said he remembered nothing from the creek bed. He said the last thing he remembered was the hard bank of the aircraft as it went down, and then he woke up in Germany. He said he'd been trying to figure out who to thank. I wrote back. I told him the names. All of them. Ose, Kowalski, Vasquez, Crane, Reyes, Tillman, Drummond, Santoro, Dalton, and Ferreira. Especially Ferreira. I told Airman that Ferreira said the calculation was straightforward. Airman wrote back one more time. Just 3 lines. He said, I've been a pilot for 11 years. There's no version of that calculation that's straightforward. He just, didn't want you to worry about what it cost him. I folded, I think, that letter and put in the same place I keep the other things I carry from that deployment. A creased map. A photograph taken at FOB Salerno where everyone is squinting into the sun and Crane is ducking under a doorframe and Kowalski looks like he's about to say something in riddles. A strip of orange VS 17 panel that I peeled off the creek bed when we were consolidating to extract. I don't take those things out very often. You don't need to look at something to know it's there. Well, I think about sometimes when a morning is cold the way Afghan mornings are cold, the kind that gets into your knuckles, is Ferreira's voice on that radio. That grocery list voice, describing his bleed off and his landing options and his status all the way down to the riverbed, like there was nothing about any of it worth raising his tone over. I was 24 years old. I'd never heard a voice like that. I still don't have a word for what it was exactly. Something between courage and mathematics. Something that only makes sense from inside the cockpit of a decision that nobody else can feel the weight of. Something that a man carries alone and describes afterward as straightforward because the alternative is admitting what he was willing to subtract. Slate 12, which 2 kilometers of broken farmland that swallowed a helicopter crew and gave them back. Nobody should have come out of that grid. We did. All of us, crew and team, and the man from 7 kilometers northwest, walking out of a dry riverbed with a sprained wrist. A cut above his eye, and that voice, still flat, still even, telling the recovery crew that he was fine and where to find the aircraft. I think about that grid more than I think about anything else from that year. Not because it was the worst day. It wasn't, not quite, but because of what Ferreira said to the board. The calculation was straightforward. Plus, and maybe for him it was, maybe that's the thing I've been trying to understand since I read it. That for some people, the version of the math where you give yourself up for the people coming down behind you isn't complicated. It just is. Like crossing the wire. Like the first step into Slate 12 with the frost crunching under your boots and the mountains turning pink at the ridges, and Kowalski up front, moving forward, talking in riddles because he was scared and going anyway. The burned orchard trees still standing, still trying.